Then it comes to the final question from the previous interviewee, Biesta, to you. So, he wants to know your view on the state of educational research, the state of educational scholarship.
Yeah, well, that's a very difficult question, and I thank Gert, of course, a lot for asking that. I'm really not sure what to say. It's a very big question. I'm not an expert in all educational research. Of course, I have certain opinions on how educational research should be done or could be done. And of course, they are very much colored by my own socialization into being an academic, which is a German socialization. And there's a difference to being a German educationalist than to being a British educationalist, for example. The way I have been socialized, of course, is to understand education studies as an academic discipline in its own right. And at the moment, I don't really see a reason why I should abandon that and why it shouldn't be like that. I do see lots of advantages in doing this kind of research or understanding education research in this way as an academic discipline, rather than just as a field of research as it is usually understood in the UK, where people from different disciplines just work together. There are lots of reasons for that, about which I could give like 3-hour lectures, which I won't do now. But one of the main reasons is I think more and important questions could be asked if you look at education studies from a disciplinary point of view, rather than looking at education from an outside disciplinary view. So the questions that you ask are different, and I think more important questions could be asked if you're looking from inside pedagogy rather than from outside on pedagogy, which is why I would always defend the idea that education studies is an academic discipline.
And what do you think it is?
What exactly do you mean?
You said that you would define educational studies.
Yes. So as every academic discipline, education studies is defined by a certain perspective on the world. So academics of whatever discipline, they all look at the world, but they all look for something else. So that's how academic disciplines are distinguished from each other. So academics have different questions about the one world we all live in. So physicists have a certain set of questions, biologists have a certain set of questions, sociologists have a certain set of questions, and of course educationalists, if you want to call them like that, have a certain set of questions. And then it does depend on what set of questions you have. And that then defines the discipline, and of course the discipline then also is defined by the accepted ways of answering those questions. So that makes academic disciplines what they are. So questions and ways of answering those questions. Of course, this changes throughout history. So if we look at the history of academic disciplines, not only do the fundamental questions change, but also the methods accepted change. For me, of course, the fundamental question is the question, if you speak English, and that's a little bit difficult for me as German, what is education?
You want to say it in German as well?
Let's remain in English, because otherwise it gets like too complicated. So for me, the fundamental question of education studies is, what is education? The problem with an Anglophone or English approach is that this question always is already answered, because most people take for granted that education doesn't mean something else than schooling. And so what binds all those people in an Anglophone sense doing educational research is that they all do research on schools. In my opinion, that leaves out a lot of things, that leaves out a lot of context in which pedagogical thinking is not only relevant but also exercised. So I find pedagogical practices everywhere in culture, not only in schools. But to see that, you have to be able to ask a pedagogical question, and you have to be able to see education out there. And to be able to see education out there, you have to have a definition of education that is not saying education is schooling. And now it becomes really interesting, because now you have to produce a definition of education. And that, curiously, in the UK, is a question that isn't asked and isn't answered. So, funnily, if you look at I think it's the second edition now of the Oxford Dictionary of Education, it has a lot of entries, but there's no entry on education, which I find quite curious, but not very surprising, because apparently it's already clear what education is. And then the question moves very, very fast onto what is education for, rather than what is education. So, and if you try to answer what is education, things become really interesting and quite difficult. So if we remain in English, we then make a distinction between formal and informal education. But when you then ask a question, okay, there seem to be two things of one kind, what then is education? What connects formal and informal education? The answer that most people then only can give is learning. But then learning happens all the time. So most of the time you don't even know that we learned something. We only later realized we have learned something, not because we realize we have certain types of knowledge, maybe, but we can't recall where we got it from. So at some point we learned it. So and in that way, to say education is schooling is too narrow. To say education is learning is too broad. So it has to be in the middle somewhere. And this becomes really tricky now. This is actually my job. This is what I do as academic research field. At least one part is to ask then and answer the question, what is education? And again, lots of lectures would be possible on this, and really interesting discussions. And we would talk about pedagogical triangles, we would talk about pedagogical relationships, and all those kind of interesting questions, which I think are much more important than lots of the questions usually asked in the context here. But also quite complicated. So if we really try to dive into the question, what is education, it's not so easy to distinguish it from like other forms, just from pure learning, which in my book is a psychological notion, is not pedagogical yet. No? Just learning is nothing pedagogical or nothing educational. Learning is psychology. And psychology is dealing with processes of learning. But it becomes pedagogy when we think of how do we support learning, for example, or how do we initiate learning. Then it becomes pedagogical, and that's then the interesting question for me. State of the art of research, I don't know. When I came here, I was grouped or was categorized as a philosopher of education. I have many opinions about this. I have never engaged in empirical research. I don't know how that works, and I don't really want to. So I can't say anything about like the state of the art of education research in that sense. All I can say is that it seems there's an emphasis on empirical research when it comes to funding, and because empirical research in a more or less natural science paradigm seems to promise lots of answers, lots of fast answers and fast solutions to apparent problems that should be solved by education. I still think that's a very narrow view of what educational research is and should be. I still think that theoretical research, conceptual research is extremely important because it provides us with notions that make sense, and it keeps us from falling into certain traps when we do even empirical research in using just words in a very superficial way, which we shouldn't be doing if we really want to be academically inclined in our research. So I see a certain bias. I don't think that's anything new. I think most people are aware of that. I'm not really sure if that will change again. Maybe not, because becoming more theoretical or theoretically inclined means to become more questioned or questioning. Things become more complicated. Things become less easy, and answers and solutions are very difficult to come by then. And of course, that's not what anyone wants, because apparently we need fast answers because there are problems that need solving right now. And so then the theoretician who makes things just more complicated is not usually welcome in any sort of like context. So I'm not very hopeful. But then again, and I wrote like another paper about what's the use of philosophy of education, and the answer is there is a use is an open question. Maybe there is a use, maybe not. But in the end, people who do that, they do that because they can't help themselves. So because they're interested in this, and they can't stop doing it. And that's also one of the reasons why I am doing it. Not because there are some utilitarian reason that I could list, but because people like doing it, and some people just like thinking about those things. And that's why they are doing it. And that's why also they should be doing it. And they should be supported in doing it. Does that say something about the general state of the art of education research in the UK or in Scotland or at my university? I'm not entirely sure, so I would not claim to have this like overview about all sorts of research. I live in a very small corner of education research, and I have a very narrow insight in what's going on there, and that's quite enough for me. And I'd rather be busying myself with all the things that I like doing than thinking about the great state of research questions about the whole field.